All living things are divided into species and labelled. Our current system of classification dates back to the 18th century and was based, rather crudely, on observable similarities. Things that looked the same were put into the same groups. But now science has given us much more sophisticated tools with which to analyse living things. This solution contains DNA. DNA is the instruction book from which all life is built. The precise sequence of this DNA defines the unique nature and appearance of every living thing. New scientific techniques like DNA profiling and genetic mapping have allowed us to measure more accurately both the differences and the fundamental common ground between ourselves and other species. We now know that humans and other African great apes shared a common ancestor as recently as 5 to 7 million years ago. We now know that over 98% of our DNA is identical. We know that the composition of our blood is so similar that a human could accept a blood transfusion from a chimpanzee. Humans are genetically closer to chimpanzees than chimpanzees are to gorillas or orangutans. If we were to reclassify all species using the knowledge we now have, would humans still sit in a class all of their own? Or would they find themselves sharing a whole new group with chimpanzees and gorillas? First to give evidence about genetics is Professor Robin Dunbar, an evolutionary biologist from Liverpool University and former president of the Primate Society of Great Britain.
Professor Dunbar, I want to go in at the deep end and ask you, are you satisfied with the rigidities of our system of classifying the great apes, the primates, humans, chimpanzees, and so on?
Most of our past classifications have been based on straight anatomical similarity. What's been very interesting, I think, in the last 10 years or so is that the ability to look at the actual genetic makeup of species has thrown up some surprising and interesting anomalies.
So what have we found about the genetic similarities of humans and chimpanzees?
What the genetic similarities tend to show up is that humans and chimpanzees are more closely related to each other than they are to the gorillas. And that, in some senses, sort of changes our whole perspective on how we view the great apes, because the chimpanzees, just to take them as a particular case, are now, rather than being our cousins, if you like, they're our sister species.
Right. And how coherent are we, humans, as a species?
Well, I think the key issue in this context in particular is that the whole of our life is built on social skills. And we exhibit those social skills because we're essentially able to think our way into the minds of other individuals in some sort of sense. That skill is something that doesn't appear naturally in newborn babies. It develops after a period of time, and it doesn't appear until about the age of 4 or 4.5 in normal children. Some humans never develop those skills. They never develop to that stage. We refer to those individuals as autistic people.
And are the apes better than those, or in their social skills, or not?
I think there is no question that the apes are better than those individuals in those key social skills.
Professor Dunbar, as I understand it, you're not placing any reliance at all on the genetics in this matter.
The genetics are important. They establish who are our nearest relatives. And the great apes are, with beyond question, our nearest relatives.
But isn't the key question whether when you look at the human race today and you look at the great apes today, whether they are indeed a different model or an upgrade? Are you saying that the human race is an upgrade of chimpanzees?
No, they're another species, if you like, of chimpanzees, one might argue. The point I'm trying to make is that our perception of the relationships among, say, the group of great apes has itself been radically changed. And this has made people in general, I think, sit up and think the gap between us and the great apes in general is not as great as we have tended to assume.
Let us say that the issue is whether you can seriously say that on the basis of genetic evidence, one can actually draw the great apes into a relationship with us via international conventions designed to extend to them precisely similar rights in certain respects to humans. There's a grand national course full of non sequiturs there, isn't there?
Absolutely not. At the end of the day, probably the most compelling evidence for extending rights to any other species must be on the basis of their cognitive abilities, their psychological abilities. The genetics simply, if you like, confirm that the chimpanzees and the other great apes beyond them are the closest species to us. That's all they do.
Would you let your daughter marry one?
I don't think my daughter would want to marry one.
So why do we...
That's not the issue. Would you let your daughter marry, say, a mentally retarded individual?
Why not the right to marry a human being? The very fact that you recoil and you think it's a ludicrous question actually, of course, is rather at the root of this debate, because you don't think they are a sufficiently similar species to permit that to happen.
No, I think that the root of the argument here surely has to do with how we treat animals in general as a whole.
But we continue to consider them as animals.
We're all animals.
That's an
You
evasion.
and I.
That's an evasion. Isn't it?
Not at all. We're all animals, and every species of animal is a unique species.
I don't see any thread of logic running through all of this. Do you want to have another go at persuading me that there is one?
Do you want to have another go at asking some more sensible questions, then?
Thank you very much, Professor.
David Mellor's witness, John Marks, is also an evolutionary biologist and professor of anthropology at Yale University.
Professor Marks, you heard what Professor Dunbar said, that there was some new evidence which would give rational people a reason to rethink the traditional view of species so as to consider ourselves more akin to the chimpanzees than has been traditionally thought. Do you know of such evidence, and what do you make of it?
As far as I'm aware, no new evidence brings to bear on the status of chimpanzees as humans, or gorillas as humans, or humans as anything other than human, and apes as anything other than apes.
And so none of this genetic evidence leads you to be at all surprised that it has been a basis of a distinction for centuries, ever since man started to think about these things, that there is a real difference between man and the apes that has not been blurred by recent scientific discovery.
I think that recent scientific discoveries have reinforced how similar we are to the apes. I think we need to appreciate the difference between the statements, "I am my brother's keeper," and "I am my brother." But I think any time you compare a human being to a non-human being, that degrades the human being, and we have to be very careful, of course, in the attribution of human rights in our society. It seems to me that the question, should the apes be given human rights, falls on two issues. The apes are not human, and we can't even guarantee human rights to humans.
Thank you very much.
Professor Marks, the genetic evidence shows that we are linked and have a common ancestor which is closest to the great apes. That's right, isn't it?
I don't think that tells us anything that anatomy hadn't already told us in the 18th and 19th century. I mean, we did know that we were closely linked to the great apes on the basis of the general similarity of our structures, of our bodies, before the invention of genetics.
We knew we looked alike, but we are now able, by these assays of our genetic makeup, to work out just within some margin of error, but just how closely we are connected now.
Well, certainly if you compare the bodies of a human, a chimpanzee, and a starfish, I think you would agree that a human and a chimpanzee are over 99% identical in any biological feature you would care to examine, regardless of genetics.
And indeed, amongst humans, we are not genetically identical. You and I are not genetically identical. David Mellor and I are not genetically identical, are we?
That's correct.
There are small differences, but sometimes they have great effects. That's right. So this definition of species cannot just hang on genetic makeup.
I agree.
I want to turn the argument a little bit now, Professor Marks. In his opening, David Mellor said that all his witnesses wanted to be humane, I think was the word that he used. And I note you yourself say that apes are sentient, emotionally complex beings, and the maltreatment of them is abhorrent, and their extinction would be a tragedy.
I agree with that. I think we stumble over whether the apes deserve human rights or some other kind of ape rights.
You see, it's our proposition that we get tangled up in simply describing these rights as human rights. The fact is that in our own human society, we've discovered that these rights are a good thing. All that we're arguing for is that this good thing that we've discovered, these human rights, should be extended to our nearest relatives. You can accept that too?
Well, I can accept that to the extent that we need to keep the focus, I think, in the current world, with the situation that we have living in it, on human rights, and to blur the problem of human rights by blurring the distinction between humans and other apes. Even though they're our closest relatives, the question of ape rights is not the same as the question of human rights.
We'll leave it there, I think, Professor Marks.